All right, we are live now. So we're going to start right away. Hi, everybody. Welcome to this webinar on transfer pricing with Ashutosh Rastogi of Amicus Services. Okay, now this is the third webinar in a series of transfer pricing webinars, and today's topic is on transfer pricing policy formulation and agreements. I want to welcome you all to this session, and we're going to hand over to Ashutosh, who's going to give a broad agenda for today, and then proceed with the policy formulation and the content of the webinar. Okay. Thank you all for being with us. And from time to time, we will take a pause and ask questions. So keep using the chat box to shout out any questions you may have with me. We are also live on YouTube, and in case you are invited to ask questions there, so that this video gets traction and we can share knowledge with more people. Thank you.
Okay, welcome friends. So this is the third webinar of the transfer pricing learning series that we have launched in collaboration with LawSikho. And this webinar focuses on transfer pricing policy formulation and the drafting of intercompany agreements, specifically for transfer pricing. So Abhyuday, why don't I just share the screen now and take them to the outline of the webinar.
I'm just allowing you to share the screen.
Yeah.
So you can share the screen now.
Right. So it's visible?
Yeah.
You can see? All right, great. So just a brief overview of the firm. Amicus is a law firm which was set up in 2011, and we have been doing tax and legal matters since then. So in tax in particular, we specialize in transfer pricing, and we have won many tribunal and high court matters in transfer pricing. Unlike other law firms which may be doing only transfer pricing litigation, we provide transfer pricing services end to end. So we help clients not only undertake defense in transfer pricing audit, but also assist in formulating transfer pricing policy documentation agreements, and then provide them litigation support from stage one right till the end. So that's just a brief on my profile. I'll just then move on to the contents of this session. So in this session, we are going to talk about why we need a transfer pricing policy to begin with. Why can't it be just that once you have undertaken a transaction and after that, whatever are the results in terms of price or profitability, why don't we just test that? So we will talk a little bit about why a transfer pricing policy is necessary. We will get into the components of transfer pricing policy. What are the various aspects which go into the designing of a transfer pricing policy? We will look at some of the policy issues with different types of manufacturers, different kinds of distributors. We will also understand what is the concept of tested party in transfer pricing, and what are the benchmarking principles around choosing a tested party. From there on, we will move on to intercompany agreements. Why intercompany agreements are critical for a solid transfer pricing defense, and how these intercompany agreements need to be drafted, keeping in mind the functionality of the taxpayer. So friends, that was an overview of this session. Now we will straight away dive into the core issues. So first aspect is why transfer pricing policy? Why do we need to think in advance before we undertake a transaction? And we need to design the price or the profitability on the basis of which the parties to the transaction will deal with each other. So what is transfer pricing policy, first of all? Well, whenever there is a related party transaction that is happening, the finance or the corporate professionals need to give some thought ahead of the transaction on the pricing for the transaction. So there are two related parties dealing with each other. The pricing is completely under the multinational company's control. They can have a low price, high price, low profit, high profit, but you need to fix a profit or a pricing point which is at arm's length, so that later on you don't fall foul of the transfer pricing regulations. Apart from the compliance perspective, every multinational company would also want that it should not end up paying more than the required tax in a high tax jurisdiction. So within the contours of the arm's length principle, if it can save or minimize its tax and achieve tax efficiency, that is another objective. So by designing a proper transfer pricing policy, you can limit your tax exposure. And of course, later on, when you move forward, you require a transfer pricing documentation. The transfer pricing documentation will also take your transfer pricing policy as the starting point. So if you have set an hourly rate as the transfer pricing policy, or you've set a cost plus markup, or whatever pricing that you have set, the transfer pricing documentation that you maintain subsequently will leverage on your transfer pricing policy. Because of all these points, it's extremely important that all corporate lawyers, all tax finance professionals who are responsible for intercompany transactions, they must be alert when they have a related party transaction in front of them. And they must discuss internally and also with their consultants, what is our transfer pricing policy going to be for a particular transaction, and then move ahead with it. So we have two concepts. One is transfer pricing policy at the group level, and one is transfer pricing policy at the transaction level. So I'm just going to give you an overview of the transfer pricing policy requirement at the group level first. This is a more macro concept. So what is happening here is that you have a head office, which may be situated in one country, head office or the principal. And then at the group level, the group needs to decide how it is going to structure its supply chain. So it may have a manufacturing unit in another country. It may have a distribution unit, again in another country, and it may be having some financial transactions between the different units of the group. It may have set up a shared services center, which will provide back office services like IT services, HR, so on and so forth. These are the various transactions which are happening within the group. The head office needs to decide at the group level what is going to be their policy on the pricing for these different transactions. And while deciding the pricing for these different transactions, they have to consider various factors. So let's take the manufacturing unit. So if the head office has set up a manufacturing unit in a low cost jurisdiction. So for example, let's say India is where they have set up a manufacturing unit. So they need to apply themselves as to what is the level of function that the manufacturing unit is doing. What is the extent of decision making which the people are undertaking at the manufacturing unit? Are they taking very critical decisions? Do they have very serious or major risk, or are they just doing a low end contract manufacturing kind of work? And therefore it may be enough to give them a cost plus markup. Similarly, if they are carrying out a distribution function in another jurisdiction, there also they need to address these important questions. Based on these questions, what is the level of function? What is the level of risk? You need to calibrate your transfer pricing policy. Your return has to match your level of functions, level of risk. For financial transactions, again, you need to decide a number of things. For example, whether the basis for a loan transaction, would that be LIBOR, Euribor? What will be the rate of interest? Will it be a foreign currency denominated loan, or will it be better to have an Indian currency denominated loan? For a shared services center also, you need to again address similar questions. At the group level, the head office will try to give a high level guidance. It will lay down what are called transfer pricing policy principles for these similar and repeating transactions. These principles, it can compile in a particular document, which can become the transfer pricing manual, transfer pricing policy manual for the group as a whole. And that manual may be referred to by the different units of the multinational company from time to time for specific transactions. This is the transfer pricing policy formulation at the group level. Then we come to transfer pricing policy at the transactional level. In transactional level transfer pricing policy, we get into the specifics. That is where the role of a consultant may also come in. So once you have a given transaction, let's say you are doing manufacturing in a low cost country, there you need to first decide for the manufacturing unit, how do we determine the price? Should we just be testing the price, or again, should it be profitability testing? And from profitability testing, a number of questions unfold. What is going to be the profitability measure, which we call the profit level indicator? what will be the base for PLI, whether we should take gross profit or net profit. If we are talking about the base in the PLI, what should that be? Should it be sales cost or should there be any other base? So this is the determination of transfer pricing policy at a transaction level, right? So there are two levels at which transfer pricing policy needs to be determined. One is at the group level and the other is at the transaction level. One very important question, which we will somewhat address in this webinar, is choosing the tested party. So whenever we talk about testing the profitability of a particular unit, the question comes up is that for which unit are we going to test the profitability? In any transaction, there are two transacting parties. So whether you want to measure A's profitability or would you like to measure B's profitability? And that question is the question of choice of tested party. We come now to ingredients of transfer pricing policy. How do you actually design a transfer pricing policy? What are the different factors that you need to consider when you are looking at transfer pricing policy? So there are a number of things which you need to take into account when you are setting the transfer pricing policy for any multinational company. First thing is your business objective. So business objective primarily means that in commercial terms, what do you want to achieve? For a particular jurisdiction, you may want to maximize the profit that you're keeping in a particular jurisdiction. Why you may want to do that? Because your shareholders or your owners may be in that particular jurisdiction. So you may want that your transfer pricing policy should be designed in such a manner that you have to have maximum profits in the head office jurisdiction. So that is one example. Supply chain analysis refers to the study of your entire supply chain. So a supply chain is something which looks like this, how your different operations are spread across the different countries. And you need to understand with reference to supply chain that where does your transaction lie? So in our example, for instance, we may be undertaking manufacturing and we want to know what is the price at which the manufactured goods are to be supplied to the distributing arm of the company. So you need to see the context of supply chain at which point or where is your locus, where are you lying? Then you have to consider alternative transfer pricing models, and you have to see that given your position in the supply chain and given the functions you're carrying out in the supply chain, which is the most appropriate transfer pricing model. You have to consider the choice of tested party. And once you have come to a conclusion that this is going to be my transfer pricing model, broadly, this will be the transfer pricing or the way I have to remunerate the related party, then you will capture the transfer pricing policy in the form of an intercompany agreement. So your intercompany agreement really is a written manifestation of your transfer pricing policy at a transactional level. And friends, it's very important that as you're drafting the intercompany agreements, your form must reconcile with substance. Substance is the actual conduct of the parties. So you cannot really have it like this, that you write one thing in the agreements and in reality, something else is happening. So for example, you may say that a particular unit is a cost plus and undertakes low end or back office activity. But in reality, let's say if the people in that unit are also undertaking critical decisions, the so-called go, no-go decisions, which means that they are deciding in terms of the product that has to be launched. They are taking critical decisions like setting up of an additional plant. They are taking other strategic decisions. Then clearly they are not a back office entity or they are not a low end entity. And therefore your agreement, which talks about cost plus basis, which talks about low value add functions being performed, that also needs to be revisited. It is not aligned with the reality. We will come to this in the subsequent slides in a little more detail. So I have spoken about what could be the varying objectives of a transfer pricing policy. You may want to maximize tax efficiency in a particular jurisdiction. You may want to keep low profits in a specific jurisdiction. And in order to design transfer pricing policy at a group level, you also have to juggle with the functions and the risks of the participating entities. Now that transfer pricing policies are necessary worldwide, and we also have base erosion and profit shifting principles, it is no longer possible to just contractually frame a transfer pricing policy devoid of the actual functions or risks that are that are lying in each jurisdiction. So if you want to move around the return across the jurisdictions, then you also have to shift the functions and risks across jurisdictions to ensure that your functions and risk are aligned with your transfer pricing policy. So let's take this example of a supply chain and let's just commence our transfer pricing policy determination process. So for example, I am a manufacturer in the supply chain. The raw materials are procured to begin with from the supplier. The supplier provides the raw materials to the manufacturing unit. Once the good is manufactured, it is sent for distribution and it finally reaches the customer or the consumers. In order to understand now what should be my transfer pricing policy for sale of finished goods from manufacturing to distribution, first thing that I need to identify is where do I lie in the supply chain, which is the locus. So in this example, I am the manufacturer. Second question that I need to ask is, what are the functions, assets, and risks of this manufacturing activity? The question then again for a manufacturer is, what is the level of function? What is the level of risk? There can be various kinds of manufacturing activity. So the answer is not so simple. So as to say that, all right, I'm doing manufacturing activity and this should be my return. There is no one size hat that fits all. We can look at this graph in front of you that there are different types of manufacturers. And for each manufacturer, the return varies depending upon the extent of functions and the risk that the manufacturer performs. In this graph, we see that as the functions and risks are increasing, the return is also increasing. There are 4 types of manufacturers we have set out here: the toll manufacturer, the contract manufacturer, and the licensed and entrepreneur manufacturer. Who is a toll manufacturer? A toll manufacturer is a manufacturer who is like a job worker. He simply will work upon the raw materials provided by the principal, put the raw materials together, convert them into the finished product, and then give the product back to you. So a toll manufacturer doesn't take any ownership of the product, of the raw material or the product. It does not own any intangibles. It is just like a service provider. A contract manufacturer has a little more risk in the sense that a contract manufacturer also takes title in raw materials. So a contract manufacturer may procure the raw materials on its own. So it has for some time that it does the manufacturing activity. It has title in the raw materials. A licensed manufacturer is a more independent manufacturer. It takes all the critical decisions on its own, but it may rely upon the technology or the intellectual property, which is licensed from the parent. And at the top, we have the entrepreneur manufacturer. The entrepreneur manufacturer is a full-fledged manufacturer. It owns the intangibles, intellectual property, takes all decisions in terms of procurement, how much to procure, and to how much to sell in the market. So entrepreneur manufacturer does all the functions of procurement, technology creation, selling in the market, and therefore is an end-to-end manufacturer. It's important to understand that for toll and contract manufacturers, they do not own any intellectual property or intangibles, and in that sense, they are low risk or low end function manufacturers. So friends, like we saw in the slide, once we have determined the locus, which is where we are in the supply chain, our queries do not end there. The next question you need to understand or ask is, what is the nature of your manufacturing activity, which is happening here? Is it contract manufacturing, toll manufacturing? Are you a licensed manufacturer? Because that will determine what is going to be the nature or the form of your intercompany agreement and also the transfer pricing policy. We will look at one more slide here, which talks about the different types of distributors. Each kind of distributor has its own transfer pricing policy and a commensurate intercompany agreement. Again, even for the distributors, the return will vary with functions and risks. So as we see that at the bottom, we have the market support service provider. A market support service provider is a very common form of marketing activity. So typically these market support service providers do market research. They collate information from the market, they find out leads, and they pass on this information to the principal. The principal, once it has access to this information, reaches out to the customers, it will then take on the negotiation and the client clinching process. So market support service provider does not participate or undertake any negotiations. From market support service provider, we move on to the commission agent. Commission agent has a little more say in the negotiation or the contract culmination process. So the agent will actually help you secure the deal, playing a more active role in the negotiations. Accordingly, the return also for a commission agent is higher. And normally an agent will expect a certain percentage of the contract, whereas a marketing support service provider is more of a service function, which can be remunerated on a cost plus basis. There are other variants as well of distributor. Above commission agent, there's what we call a limited risk distributor. So a limited risk distributor undertakes most of the functions of a distributor except inventory management, debtor management, and it also does not own title to the goods, or it owns title for a very temporary period of time, which is called the flash title. Above limited risk distributor is concept of normal distributor or the entrepreneur distributor. So your entrepreneur distributor, again, like the entrepreneur manufacturer, is the full-fledged distributor, which undertakes all the functions of distribution activity on its own. Entrepreneur distributor may even own the marketing intangible. It may be creating a brand for itself in the market. This function, by the way, is not a function which is carried out by the commission agent or the market support service provider. Only a normal distributor and an entrepreneur distributor would be doing the branding function in the market. A limited risk distributor also does not do a branding function in the market. A limited risk distributor does not have debtors risk, creditors risk, or inventory risk. What does that mean? That really means that a limited risk distributor merely takes title to goods on paper. It may have a flash title, and then the title passes on to the end customer. It doesn't really take physical possession of the goods, and therefore it is safeguarded from your inventory risk, and it also is assured of a fixed return from the principal. That safeguards it from the debtors risk and the creditors risk. These are somewhat complicated concepts. Probably we can discuss them in a little more detail, but for time being, it will suffice for you to understand that at each leg of the supply chain, you have to ask still more nuanced questions, and you have to understand what is your characterization, right? So while within a supply chain, you may have a procurement function, manufacturing, and distribution. There are various shades of each of these functions which match with different risks and return. So that is another question that needs to be asked when you are undertaking transfer pricing policy formulation. Another aspect, critical aspect linked with transfer pricing policy formulation is choice of tested party. What is the tested party? And when you are having a transaction between two related parties, A and B, how do you decide whether you should be testing profitability of A or you should be testing profitability of B? There is guidance available from OECD and even Indian case law that you have to opt for the least complex entity as the tested party. The next question is, what do you mean by least complex, or which is the simpler entity? Well, simpler entity concept, you need to break it down into three different parts: functions, assets, risks. In terms of functions, your least complex or simple entity will be undertaking the simpler functions. Again, what does that mean? So you can't be carrying out very critical decision making or strategic decisions, which normally the head office or the entrepreneur takes. So if you are a contract manufacturer and you're carrying out manufacturing activity based on the supervision instruction of the principal, broad guidance of the principal, then you are carrying out relatively simpler functions. In terms of assets, you are not owning any intangibles. And in terms of risk, commensurate with the level of function that you're carrying on, your risk profile is also simple. If all these conditions are met, the identified entity is least complex or relatively simple, then you should take that as the tested party and fix a profitability for that tested party for the specific transaction and test that as profitability. Why are we taking the simpler entity? Why are we taking the simpler entity to begin with as the tested party? Why do we not test the more complex entity? The answer for that, friends, lies in the valuation principle, that normally you cannot value or benchmark entrepreneur or entrepreneurial returns, simply because of the fact that entrepreneurial returns are highly fluctuating, volatile. Each entrepreneur has certain uniqueness about himself or itself, and therefore it is not possible to peg the profitability of an entrepreneurial unit. At a particular point of time, in a time period, the head office may make supernormal profits. In another time period, the head office may end up with a loss. So you should not be benchmarking or testing what you cannot control and which is determined by market. So friends, one important fundamental in transfer pricing is that whenever you're testing or even when you're setting the transfer pricing policy, you do not set the transfer pricing policy for an entrepreneur. You do not benchmark entrepreneurial returns or returns of the head office simply because their value adding functions are not benchmarkable. They can result in astounding returns, and they can result in astounding loss also at different time periods. So that's not something which is really within your control. Another aspect of transfer pricing policy is significant people functions. Whenever you're designing a transfer pricing policy, so for example, we were discussing the example of this manufacturer, and we were trying to find out what kind of manufacturer is this entity in our supply chain. And we said that we have to understand what kind of manufacturing it is: entrepreneur manufacturer, limited risk manufacturer, so on and so forth. So there a question that we need to ask, and we always do that whenever we do transfer pricing functional interviews, which is that what are the kind of functions which the management at the manufacturing unit performing? When I say these functions, so we ask questions like, are they taking the critical decisions in terms of setting up an additional plant? Are they deciding which is the product which is to be launched in the market? Are they also deciding upon the future strategy of the manufacturing unit, the vision? Who is determining all of this? These are called, in transfer pricing terminology, significant people functions. So linked with your transfer pricing policy formulation is the question of where in the supply chain these critical functions are being performed. If all these critical functions were being performed at the level of this manufacturing unit, it would most likely become the entrepreneur. It would become the engine in the supply chain, which is pushing the growth for the entire group. And then we would probably not fix the transfer pricing return or the profitability for this manufacturing unit. Guided by the principle of choosing the relatively simple entity, we would move away from the manufacturing unit and would probably try to benchmark returns at the other ends of the transactions. Let's say the supplier, or let's say at the distribution. We would probably move on there and try to peg the return at that point. So significant people functions, my friends, is the substance in the transfer pricing context. What is actually happening on ground? And I had mentioned that if there is a variation between your contractual documents and what is actually happening on ground, which is the actual conduct or the functions which the people are carrying out, then for purpose of transfer pricing, we have to be guided by the significant people functions that are being carried out. Contractual documentation is ancillary, and if they are not matching, conduct shall prevail. This is another aspect that you need to consider when you are doing the transfer pricing policy formulation. In fact, significant people functions have had quite a history in the transfer pricing jurisprudence. In 2003, there was a concept called key entrepreneurial risk-taking functions. It came up for the first time in OECD's draft attribution report on draft report on attribution of profits to PE. Again, there was this concept of SPF, significant people functions, introduced in OECD's model tax convention in 2010. And under the BEPS action plan, we have the concept of DEMPE functions, which is called development, exploitation, maintenance, and protection function, which we have in the context of BEPS action plan for 2015. So OECD has time and again been emphasizing on the actual conduct of the parties. It is now no longer possible within a multinational enterprise to just contractually fix the transfer price or the return for any particular entity. You cannot do that dehorse of the actual functions which are happening for a specific entity on the ground. These functions, which known by various names, and now we actually refer to them as significant people functions, they need to be studied before you can formulate your transfer pricing policy. Studying these functions is important so that tomorrow when there is a survey or there is a let's say a on-site operation by the on-site visit by the tax authorities, it should not so happen that they discover something else and your contractual documents were saying something else. So you must ensure that your substance mirrors the contractual documentation. I will give you some more examples of what are the significant people functions in terms of the various risks which they give rise to. So if you're saying that a particular entity has market risk, then the functions in relation to the marketing activity, for example, the marketing or the pricing decisions, at what price to sell, how much to sell, all these functions should also be undertaken at that entity. The people who are housed in that entity should be undertaking these functions. If somebody is evaluating the credit profile of a customer and then deciding whether we should actually deal with this customer or not, then that entity is also taking the credit risk. Which part of the multinational enterprise decides on the contract? Who has the final decision-making power to agree or not to agree on a contract? If entity A in an enterprise has that power, then entity A will also harbor the contract risk. Similarly, who takes the critical decisions in terms of technology? Whatever be the risk pertaining to a particular decision, it will follow the decision maker. So you need to evaluate where are the critical decision makers spread out across the supply chain. Based on that, you will determine the risk profile of that entity in the supply chain. You cannot contractually say that, all right, entity A in the supply chain, the head office believes that entity A should be a low risk entity. Sorry, that doesn't work in the as per the latest thinking on transfer pricing. You need to ensure that the people who are housed in entity A are actually not taking the critical decisions which correlate with specific risks. If you are not having those functions there, then yes, perhaps it's a low risk entity. On the other hand, if in a particular entity, all critical decisions in relation to credit evaluation of customer, contract evaluation, even the market and the price evaluation are being taken, then clearly that entity is taking a lot of critical decisions, and that entity is also housing a lot of risks like the market risk, credit risk, contract risk, so on and so forth. So that entity becomes the complex entity. So all this, choice of tested party, significant people functions, what kind of manufacturer, distributor you are, all that which I've explained in the previous slides, all that is interlinked. And it really begins with understanding what is actually going on at a particular unit. So you review the entire supply chain, you analyze what are the decisions that are being carried out at the different levels. Then you understand the risks which are associated with those decisions. Once you have understood what the functional profile of a particular unit is, and you have also understood what transfer pricing model you are going to apply commensurate with that, you will formulate your intercompany agreement, which will be, like I said, a written manifestation of your transfer pricing policy. Once your policy is set, thereafter, you may actually, for audit purpose, you may test the policy by benchmarking with reference to comparables.
So I have a question here. One of the viewers has asked that whether transactions of an entrepreneur will not be benchmarked at all, where in the supply chain the person is taking entrepreneurial risk, or
Yes.
whether its transactions will be benchmarked to related parties.
Right. So I'll just move on to that slide. So yes, we talked about that. We talked about not benchmarking entrepreneurial return. This is the fundamental principle of transfer pricing exercise that as far as possible, you should not benchmark an entrepreneur. What do you mean by an entrepreneur? I have explained that
Yeah,
entrepreneur
that's fine.
typically carries out all the significant people functions. So you should not benchmark an entrepreneur. If you do benchmark an entrepreneur under some exceptional situations, for example, you may not have data available for the relatively simple entity. You may not have financial data, segmental data available for the relatively simple entity, because of which you are forced to benchmark an entrepreneur in order to meet the transfer pricing compliance. Well, that would be an exception. But normally to begin with, as a matter of rule, you should not benchmark an entrepreneur.
And most transfer pricing authorities will respect that across the world. Or we can say this for India.
Well,
What
yes.
is, how do we go about it?
Yeah. That's a very that's a good question, and I will give you the Indian experience on this. What is happening is that most of the times we do not get data on the financial results of the relatively simple entity. These relatively simple entities may be overseas entities, and they can even be some manufacturing segments, or or procurement centers housed as a segment of a bigger overseas arm. We may not be getting segmental data for the manufacturing or procurement which is taking place overseas. And the consequence of that is that we have to benchmark the Indian entity, which is the entrepreneur, to comply with the transfer pricing regulations, because we have to still prove that transfer pricing is arm's length. Given that we don't get overseas data, we have to make do with whatever data is available, and we end up benchmarking the entrepreneur. Now, technically, that is not a very sound transfer pricing principle, but transfer pricing is an art, it's not a science, and you have to make compromise at a number of places. So you end up benchmarking entrepreneur many times. Tax authorities also, they may ask for overseas data, but if for various reasons the multinational company is unable to provide or does not want to provide, you have to make do with whatever is available. So benchmarking an entrepreneur, my friends, happens in real life. You do end up benchmarking the entrepreneur entity, but that is a compromise due to lack of data or for any other reasons. Abhyuday, I hope this answers your question.
Works, yeah. And I had a question on the latest slide on which you were.
Yes.
The current slide where we are. If you could go there, then I can ask.
This one?
Yes. In this one, actually, I wanted to ask that what is the different kinds of work that a tax consultant does in all these with respect to all these functions? Like there could be advisory, there could be drafting, but if we could have some heads of work, that would be really great.
Yes. So the in-house personnel in a corporate firm or in any company, their role is that the moment they come across a cross-border related party transaction, they should become alert, and they should know that this is where transfer pricing regulations will kick in. So they should be aware that they need to have a robust transfer pricing policy in place. That's number one. Number two, they need to be aware that matching with the transfer pricing policy, they need to have an intercompany agreement in place, right? And then they also need to be aware that after the intercompany agreement is there, for the compliance with Indian transfer pricing regulations, you need transfer pricing documentation also and filing of certain forms. So they need to be aware that you require all these compliances, all these documents to be there. It would not be, it would be too much to expect, from in-house counsels to actually draft the transfer pricing policy. That is where you need the help of a consultant, because the consultant who's obviously trained in this whole art of transfer pricing will help you deconstruct your supply chain, figure out what is the relatively simpler entity in the supply chain. Consultants also have access to databases, so they will be able to provide to you the return that you need to set as a part of your transfer pricing policy. They will also, you may be able to prepare a shell of an intercompany agreement, but you again need a consultant's help to finalize the intercompany agreement from a transfer pricing perspective. So Abhyuday, to answer your question, you really need a consultant's help to get a strong transfer pricing policy in place. But yes, the role of the in-house counsel is to identify uh, areas where transfer pricing regulations will kick in, to cull out the necessary information, to liaise with the consultant and get all this in place. So both have to work in tandem once you identify a related party transaction. We can take more questions at this point of time, because I'm sure this is not a simple concept. We have tried to deconstruct it as much as possible, but transfer pricing policy formulation is certainly one of the more complex areas in transfer pricing. If there are any more questions, any more doubts which audience has, I'll be very glad to entertain.
Anybody has any questions, feel free to type in so that we can ask. I also have a few questions to ask. Can I ask? So one thing I wanted to say also to people is that, one second, let me switch to sharing view. One thing I wanted to say is that it's interesting that a tax consultant would do the form filing, the agreement part, and the advisory part, and would he also do the disputes part if there is a dispute raised by the TP officer? Right. Then the same tax consultant would be involved, right? Like unlike in a strict corporate law firm, the structure is that you have advisory work separately and agreements is like advisory and agreements is together and litigation is separate. Here it wouldn't be like that, right?
Well, yes. Normally the consultant should be able to undertake the job end to end. Yes, whole piece. At least we as a firm do the entire piece. So we help in shaping the policy, transfer pricing policy, do the documentation, and then also stand by with the client for any possible litigation. And obviously, since we have framed the transfer pricing policy, we know that we will be able to withstand the test of scrutiny by courts.
I have one more question. Usually when we draft policies, let's say employment policies or company policies, okay, they are often made binding by incorporation by reference through an agreement. So an agreement makes the policies binding. Here it seems it's the other way, that you have a group level transfer pricing policy which governs all the entities, and all entities are to enter into intercompany agreements based on the policy for specific transactions. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right. But it's not really the other way. You carry on with your question, I'll answer it. Please complete your question.
So this is the only question that I was grappling with, that, is it here that the group companies have a policy and how do they make it binding on one another? And then how does the intercompany agreement flow from it? How is it specific to particular transactions, and must it comply with, the policy in terms of identifying the risks and all of that? Like, how does that connection work?
Okay, well, so we'll just move back to our slides on group and transaction level. So we had just examined transfer pricing policy at group level.
Correct.
So what happens is that arm's length principles by and large are universal principle. How do you price a transaction? How do you determine profitability? There is a lot of economics which goes behind these decisions, and this economics doesn't vary. The logic of it doesn't vary as we move across jurisdictions. So at the group level, you can determine the broad contours of a transfer pricing policy. So depending upon your commercial requirements, you may in your group have a principal office. You may have some cost plus contract manufacturing units, which are situated in low cost jurisdictions. You may have some procurement centers. You may have multiple units of these types. Now, rather than directing each and every unit that you need to have this particular cost plus margin or this particular pricing, applying the principles of arm's length pricing, the group may give broad directions in the form of a transfer pricing policy manual that you have to follow this guidance whilst determining your transfer pricing policy. So what will happen is that at the level of a contract manufacturing unit in another country where you have a subsidiary of the group, the subsidiary will take the group policy document. Subsidiary will evaluate where does it fit in the scheme of the group transfer pricing manual. So let's say the manual talks about the pricing for a contract manufacturing unit. So the subsidiary will say obviously, okay, I fall in this category. So what does the group
And
policy?
this will have only principles, so it will not have actual numbers. Or it could have some indicative numbers and principles, right? The
Yes.
policy manual.
So policy manual typically does not have the numbers because the numbers vary from year to year. As your comparables, as your industry data gets updated every year, so those numbers also have to be updated. So a policy manual generally talks about principles. It may sometimes stipulate a profitability percentage also for contract manufacturing units, for limited distributor unit. But obviously, those numbers hold good only for a certain period of time, maybe 3 years, 4 years at the max. 3 years normally would be the max, and after that, you have to reevaluate. Okay, so by and large, they may not have these numbers. So once the subsidiary company understands where it lies with respect to the manual framework, policy framework, it will have to do a little bit, it may have to do a little bit of fine tuning at its own end. So it may even get a template of a contract manufacturing agreement from the group. Rest is a little bit of fine tuning which it has to do. But certainly a policy document solves 75 to 80% of the decision making for the back office units in the multinational company.
Okay. Are there requirements on how this policy document is to be approved and followed by the subsidiaries? Any procedural requirements on it or?
Okay, so a policy document at a group level is an internal document for the multinational company, and it helps for all the people in the finance team and the tax team of the group to be aware of what the group transfer pricing policy is on various transactions. It's a document which they need to prepare and keep with themselves. It is not required to be filed anywhere, but it gives a lot of direction when you're setting the price for a transaction. If you do not have a transfer pricing policy manual at the group level, what will happen is that there may be random, chaotic, and ad hoc approaches at the operational level by different entities. So different entities may not necessarily be setting a price which is dovetailed. You may have a price for a contract manufacturing unit designed in a particular manner in one country, and you may have a completely different principle being followed in another country.
Correct. But you don't use the management structure of the group, like the parent will nominate directors on the subsidiary to the subsidiary. So you don't use any flow to that the transfer pricing manual is adopted by the subsidiary in a board meeting, so that now it is followed by the team members of the subsidiary. Are those procedures followed, or it's not needed to do that?
Not really. You don't really require to formally to have the subsidiaries board to formally endorse the transfer pricing policy, because it's a transfer pricing policy. It has a lot of directive influence on every group member.
Got it. And could you explain a little on the agreement, like how it would have the specifics or how it would not have? How are the margins? You said no, every 3 years they change.
Yes.
So how does the agreement incorporate those kind of changes? Is it amended every time, or is it pursuant to instructions or email correspondence or letters that it is agreed upon?
Yes, so we have specific slides on the intercompany agreement, which are still to be discussed. So I think we will now move on to intercompany agreement.
Okay.
And we will take up that in detail. That is certainly an area where in-house counsels would find that to be of their interest. Before that, Abhyuday, we have 2 case studies on transfer pricing policy determination. So we are done with the conceptual part of transfer pricing policy determination. Quickly, I can just run through these case studies and see how we apply the principles that we have discussed in the context of these case studies. So we have before us a fact pattern wherein the risk-bearing entity is in India, ICO, and it is procuring raw materials from an associated enterprise which is overseas. The overseas entity is a contract manufacturer. What that means is that overseas entity does not take any critical decisions in terms of marketing. It has an assured market. It will manufacture only on demand from ICO. ICO in turn will sell to the customers. So ICO is going to take all the risk, such as market risk, price risk, etc. ICO is facing the open market. Whereas as far as the contract manufacturing AE is concerned, AE has an assured market. It gets orders from ICO. AE manufactures in response to those orders, and AE also will be given some assured return for that. Now, in this supply chain, it's very easy to understand which is the simple entity. It is the overseas entity, which is the contract manufacturing entity. It is the relatively simple entity by all the standards of choice of tested party. It has relatively simple functions. It does not own any intangibles, and it does not bear any of the risks like market risk, price risk, spread risk, so on and so forth. Risk-bearing entrepreneur ICO, on the other hand, is bearing all the market risk, price risks. It does not have any guaranteed sale because it's facing the market. Whatever ICO stocks up with it in terms of the product, there's no guarantee it will be taken from the market. For associated enterprise, there is a guarantee that whatever it will make, ICO is going to buy. Okay. So in this situation, we have clearly determined that the associated enterprise A is this relatively simple entity. So if I have to design a transfer pricing policy or such a setup where I purchase raw materials from associated enterprise and I want to know how should I remunerate my associate enterprise, I will determine the profitability. I will peg the profitability at the associated enterprise level. I will say that A is the simple entity. It should recover all its cost of manufacturing, plus it should get a profit margin, which is similar to the profit margin earned by comparable manufacturers. And I will put that markup in my intercompany agreement. I will typically have a contract manufacturing agreement with my associated enterprise, and based on benchmarking, I will put the margin also in the associated in the agreement. So that is how I'm going to design my transfer pricing policy and also my intercompany agreement. So that is case study one. There is one more facet to this, which is that we just right now looked at the choice of tested party from the angle of functions, assets, and risks. There is one more angle to why we should not take ICO as the tested party, why we should not test the profitability of ICO. And that angle simply is that if we take, for example, the total cost base for ICO. So this, in our hypothetical example, in the slide before you, this pie chart shows how the total cost base for ICO looks like. So if you take the total cost base for ICO, in our hypothetical example, the purchase from associated enterprise is the orange part. It is just 3.13% of the total sale from A. Sorry, of the total cost base of ICO, only 3.13% is purchase of raw materials from A. In such a scenario, it does not make sense to test profitability of ICO when ICO's cost base and sale is completely market determined. So profit for ICO is sales less whatever it has purchased from associate enterprise, and also whatever it has purchased from third parties. The element of related party transaction which requires testing is only AE cost. So if you are going to test the profitability of ICO, what you are doing is that just to test the pricing of 3.13% of the total cost base, you are testing the profit for ICO, which is determined by sales, which is a completely market determined figure. Your third party cost, non-A cost, is also completely market determined. They're third party cost. Your AE cost, which is just 3.13% of your total cost, is alone what is determined internally by the multinational company. So you can't be testing the profit at ICO level when you really want to just test the pricing for 3.13%. So if you would recall our earlier slides in the previous webinar on dilution principle, you should always try to test that profit or that pricing, which is very directly impacted by the related party transaction. So it is better that we test the cost plus profit at the AE level and not the profitability at the ICO level. Profitability at the AE level is completely in our control. The multinational company decides what profit we have to keep here. whereas profitability at the ICO level is influenced by factors which are beyond our control. The third-party expenses, the revenue we get from the market. So we are not really capable of controlling all of this. And therefore, because of this perspective, additional reason as well, it makes sense to test profitability at the AE level. I hope you were able to understand this. If there are doubts pending, we can address that.
Any questions on this case study? Could you all follow why we decided to test for profitability or for the cost at the AE level and not at the Indian company level? Yes, no, you all can send me chat messages.
You can once
Don't be silent, please.
Once the webinar is available on YouTube, you can just go through these examples again and rethink. Just to summarize as a testing principle, we should always test the profitability at that point where we have complete control over the price determination. So profitability of ICO is only very minutely impacted by a related party transaction to the extent of only 3.13%. So there's no point testing the profitability at ICO level. Whereas profitability at the AE level is completely determined by the multinational company. So that is the profit that you need to decide also, and you can also test it every year based on comparables. So there's a principle of transfer pricing policy testing and formulation, which is that test what is set. So what is set means what is exactly in your control. So in the supply chain, it is the markup that you are giving to your associate enterprise, which is in your control. The profit that ICO will earn as an entrepreneur, that is not in your control. So don't worry too much about it. Go back in the supply chain to find out the points which are within your control, fix a profit margin there and test it from time to time. That is the message of this slide before us.
Shubham has a question on this, that if non-AE cost is less and AE cost is more, then can we test the Indian entity rather than the AE, even if the Indian entity is the key decision maker?
Ideally, no, we should not be doing that. So in our example, if instead of 3.13%, this, we were to flip this. So AE cost is 34.38% and non-AE cost becomes 3.13%. Then also based on the benchmarking principle of testing the simpler entity, my answer would be no. I would say that you have to test the associated enterprise profitability and not the ICO profitability. So in our hypothetical example, the way we had constructed this was an additional reason for not testing profitability of the Indian entity. But regardless of that, even if your percentage increases, percentage of purchase of raw material increases, then also you would still be an entrepreneur. You would be taking all the critical decisions. So it does not make sense to test your profitability. I hope that answers Shubham's question.
Perfect, yeah.
So we have
Shubham is a tax consultant, he could follow. I hope the others have also been able to follow. Okay.
So these slides are slides which, similar slides which we had presented before a group of tax heads and CFOs. And I can very well understand if some of the audience members who are not so well versed with tax aspects are not able to follow. But if you can still get the gist of it, that in transfer pricing you have to test the least complex entity and you move away from complexity. That will hold you in good stead. And in another case study, we are considering somewhat different facts, but again the same principle comes up. So in this case study before you, again, ICO is the risk-bearing entrepreneur. It owns intangibles. It is the risk taker. All ideas in terms of cost-benefit analysis, feasibility study, concept design, deployment of proprietary knowledge, all those critical functions are being performed by the risk-bearing entrepreneur. So once the product is formulated, developed, what ICO does is that ICO sets up a associated enterprise, wholly owned subsidiary overseas. And that overseas entity undertakes contracting with customers in the local overseas jurisdiction. The functions that the associate enterprise performs is functions like licensing, marketing, understanding the requirements of the customer. So you can see AE is contracting with the customers. AE contracts with the customers. AE takes the product from ICO, and then AE, whatever it collects from the customers, pays back the ICO for the product that the ICO is actually providing. Now, if we again apply the tested party principles here, in terms of functions, assets, and risks, we can see associated enterprise is the relatively simple entity. ICO is the more complex entity. It is the risk-bearing entrepreneur. The next question, so how do we set the transfer pricing policy in this situation? Well, you have to understand in this entire supply chain, what is associate enterprise? So it is a distributor. It is purchasing from ICO and it is selling to the end customer. The other question, the next question, what kind of distributor is it? Is it a full-fledged distributor, entrepreneur distributor, commission agent, or is it just a limited risk distributor? From the facts of the case where we've seen that associate enterprise is bearing very little risks, it's not doing any of those functions which will give rise to significant risks. It seems more like a limited risk distributor. So the appropriate transfer pricing model in this situation would be that the associate enterprise is assured of a routine return on sales, which are made to the end customer, and the rest of the money is passed on to ICO. That is the transfer pricing model, simplistically speaking, in this situation. Abhyuday, if audience has any questions on this, would be glad to take up.
Yeah. Shivam is giving you a compliment. He has worked under you, he said.
Right.
No on what? I don't know what he's saying. No.
Anyway.
Okay, anyway, let's go ahead. No other, please feel free to write questions, and if you're finding something difficult, you want something to be repeated, please ask us, okay?
Right. So sometimes when you are doing overseas testing, there are a number of advantages to apply transfer pricing principles correctly and not always test the entity which is in India. And the advantages are that supposing the Indian entrepreneur ever makes losses, then you will not be in a difficult situation before the tax authorities, because right from day one, you have set your transfer pricing policy right. You have gone ahead, taken the technically right decision and tested the least complex entity, even if it was the overseas entity. So you are testing profitability at the overseas level. So whether there is a situation is good or bad in India, whether Indian head office entrepreneur is making loss or profit, your transfer pricing policy will remain unaffected by that. And so you will have a smooth sail before the tax authorities. Even if supposing there is a slump in India, you don't really have to panic, and you don't have to say that, oh my God, profitability India has fallen. Now, how will I defend my intercompany transactions? You've already determined what the profitability at the overseas level is to be. You will simply document it properly, and you will say that overseas entity is the simpler entity. It carries out these functions, with reference to comparables. This is the return it is earning. We have kept that return, and rest of the profit has been passed on to the Indian company. So based on that, there are chances that you will still have a smooth sail, despite the fact that profitability in India could be falling, or you may even have losses. So that is the advantage of doing overseas testing or testing based on the right principles. You have a robust policy which is tenable for law. Now let's just have a look at the key clauses of intercompany agreements from transfer pricing perspective. So we've seen that transfer pricing agreement is a manifestation of your transfer pricing policy. So before you fix the transfer pricing policy, you have to do a lot of fact finding, understanding the functional analysis, determining the characterization type, transfer pricing model and all that. And once you have the transfer pricing agreement, once you have fixed the transfer pricing policy, you need to capture that in the form of a transfer pricing agreement. Why do you need a transfer pricing agreement? Is it mandatory under Indian transfer pricing regulations? Well, the answer is that you don't statutorily require a transfer pricing agreement under transfer pricing regulations. But yes, for any transaction, as it happens between third parties, when you are going to a court of law, the law always requires some signed document on the basis of which you can understand the terms between the transacting parties. So in the same manner, if you have a written document between the different arms of a multinational enterprise, that document the tax authorities can always refer to. to understand the distribution of functions, assets, and risks between the two parties. So if your intercompany agreement mirrors the functional reality, you will be one up in your litigation with the tax department. You will simply hand out the transfer pricing agreement and you will say that this is how our functions, assets, and risks have been distributed, and this is how we have benchmarked the transaction. So actually, just as possession in law is considered 9 points of law, an intercompany agreement which conforms to your functional reality is more than half the battle won. Bear in mind that if down the line your functional profile undergoes a change, or an entity which was a cost plus unit at a point of time, a contract manufacturer, if that entity becomes a full-fledged manufacturer, then you also need to revise your intercompany agreements. So that is why it is necessary that your intercompany agreements need to be periodically reviewed. And you should ensure that your intercompany agreements are matching with the on-ground reality of what is happening at the factory level or what's happening at the unit level. There's a tug of war between agreements and the conduct of the parties. It's really it's not very difficult to understand that you can't have sham agreements. Your agreements must mirror the actual conduct. OECD has time and again harped on this, that if there is any deviation between the terms of the agreement and conduct of the parties, then they will go by the actual conduct, because it is expected that the agreement will just be capturing the terms of the actual conduct. Wherever there is a deviation, the conduct shall override. At this point, I can share with you an interesting case which we had handled some time back. And in that situation, what had happened was that a multinational company had determined one of its entities as a cost plus manufacturing entity. However, over a period of time, based on commercial need, they transformed the entity into a full-fledged manufacturing entity, but they failed to update the agreement for some reason. And the same agreement was filed with the tax department. Then the question came up whether the manufacturing entity is a low-end entity based on the agreement, or should it really be earning a higher level of return, because subsequently it had become entrepreneurial in nature. Tax department, interestingly, had access to the previous agreement, which had not been updated. And that agreement was continuing even later on. It had a clause in it which said that the agreement shall continue in force unless terminated. Based on that agreement, the department challenged that how are you keeping a low profit for this entity? It should have it cannot have significantly higher return, because based on your agreement, it is a cost plus entity. So it took a lot of evidence furnishing, and it took a very detailed exercise to disprove the outdated agreement first and to establish new facts. Relying on the OECD guidance that conduct will override the agreement, we were able to put up a fighting case. But it took all our resources to first negate our own agreement and then prove something which was the reality. The moot point being that intercompany agreements need to be taken seriously, and they need to be contemporaneously updated as and when your ground reality changes. We just look at some of the critical transfer pricing clauses in agreements. So like we mentioned, that when we are setting the policy, we look at functions, assets, and risks. So in any intercompany agreement, it is important that the functions which are being performed by the respective parties, those functions have to be delineated correctly. The assets, who's going to own the intellectual property. So for example, if a company in India is doing contract software development, or let's say it is doing contract manufacturing, by definition, a contract software service provider or a contract manufacturer does not own the intellectual property resulting from its activity. That intellectual property will be owned by the principal. So you need to have appropriate clauses in the agreement which ensure that the IP will reside with the principal. And once you have determined in the agreement what the functions are to be performed by each entity, automatically your risks are also taken care of, because all the risks which are associated with specific functions, they will also align with the respective parties. And then in the transfer pricing agreement, it's also important that you lay down what is the transfer pricing model which is being followed for the transaction. So if you are having a cost plus model, your transfer pricing agreement will stipulate clearly that to remunerate the contract manufacturing entity, you are adopting a cost plus model. You will define the operating cost, and you may even stipulate the markup, or you may just generally say that a markup shall be provided on cost, which will be in line with the industry standard. So these are some critical aspects for transfer price from a transfer pricing perspective, which need to be captured in an intercompany agreement. I will come to the most critical aspect of an intercompany agreement from a transfer pricing perspective. Since transfer pricing is all about the testing of the arm's length remuneration, the payment terms which you embody in a transfer pricing agreement, they obviously take center stage. So your agreement has to define the arm's length price. Like we mentioned, it could be a markup or it could also be an hourly rate. You have to, if it's a markup scenario, then you need to define what are the operating costs. You also need to set the time period for remuneration. So you could have a quarterly payment from your related enterprise. You could have half yearly payment. You could also have monthly payments. So normally for service providers like contract software service providers or back office service providers like BPOs, you may be receiving monthly payments from your parent or your associate enterprise. There's another important clause which we generally find in case of cost plus entities, which is called the true up clause. And the purpose of true up clause is to ensure that in the last few months of the financial year, say February or March, you are doing a true up on the profitability to reach your target. So if for the entire year you have fixed cost plus 15 as the markup, and around February you review what is the profitability with the contract manufacturing entity, and you realize that it is actually it's coming out to be 13%. So you will bill extra in the last few months to ensure that you get to the requisite 15% markup. So there is a clause which is called the true up clause, which is also inserted in most of the cost plus agreements. So whenever a transfer pricing expert looks at an intercompany agreement, he will specifically give attention to these clauses, which are going to determine what the transfer pricing will be like. In the overall agreement, you have many standard legal clauses like definitions, severability, indemnification, governing law. And then you will have other clauses which are at the heart of a transfer pricing exercise. So we have bifurcated them into legal versus the transfer pricing clauses. So when you are considering any agreement from a transfer pricing review, in particular, you have to pay attention to these aspects: effective date, time period, scope of services, role and responsibility. So this ties in with the function aspect: scope of services, role and responsibility. Right? It ties in with the functions and the risk aspect. More the function, more the risk. Lower the function, lesser the risk. So if you are designing a transfer pricing policy in a manner that you are keeping a cost plus markup, or you are saying that this entity is a low-end entity, then its scope of services, role, responsibility should also be commensurate. Now, in the agreement, you can't say that this cost plus entity is going to take strategic decisions or no-go decisions. You better ensure that the function that you're mentioning there, these are the low-end functions. So remuneration clause also, like we mentioned, this could be, depending on the policy you've set, an hourly rate model or cost plus model or a return on sales model. So you need to have a robust remuneration clause. Invoicing terms is essentially in how much time are you going to raise the invoice? Will it be monthly, quarterly, or will it be annually? So in invoicing, in terms of invoicing clause also, we've had some dispute on receivables in the Indian transfer pricing landscape. So if your payment is outstanding for too much time, the Indian tax authorities treat that as a loan given by the associate enterprise and they impute interest on it. So if you are saying in your intercompany agreement that you will get money from your associate enterprise in a month's time, there should not be excessive delay. You should normally get your company, you should get the payment in a month's time or 2 months' time. Otherwise, there is exposure of transfer pricing adjustment at the hands of transfer pricing officer. Then you also have to look at the ownership of IP. IP ownership is very critical in all your contract manufacturing and your contract services arrangements. Access to information and review, periodic review. All these clauses have to be tailored properly to ensure that you are projecting the related party as the contract manufacturer or the toll manufacturer that you wanted it to be. If you are not going to ensure that your clauses are reflecting that, then there will be a very difficult time in the transfer pricing audit. And then you can have, so many different types of agreements for all these different entities. You will have a specific agreement for a contract manufacturer, toll, limited distributor, commission agent. So again, you will see that the clauses for these different agreements vary. So for a commission agent, in the clauses of role responsibility itself, you will mention about the active role of the agent in negotiating the contract. For a licensed manufacturer, in the agreement, you will talk about the licensing of know-how from the owner of technology. For a contract manufacturer, you will mention in the contract, in the agreement, that the contract manufacturer will manufacture only on receipt of an order from the principal. For a toll manufacturer, you have to state that it is not going to purchase the raw material, but the raw material shall be provided by the associated enterprise. Because unlike a contract manufacturer, a toll manufacturer does not even procure the raw material itself. For a market support service provider, its functions are very simple. It will, like I mentioned, only do the research, gather information, so on and so forth. A market support service provider will not take part in negotiation of the contracts with the customer. If it starts doing that, it is more likely to become a commission agent. And the return for an agent is significantly higher than a market support service provider. So you have to evaluate, what as per your group policy, what as per your group objective, what do you want the enterprise to be? And once you have evaluated that, you have to ensure that your clauses in the agreement in terms of functions, ownership of intellectual property and the risks are also commensurate with your objective. And therefore you design the clauses accordingly. So Abhyuday, that is all that we have in this session on transfer pricing policy formulation and agreements. I'll be happy to take up questions, if any, from the audience now.
So this was a very nice technical session, much more in complexity than the earlier sessions. So I want to ask some of the viewers, how did it go for you? Do you have questions? Were you able to follow? Quickly, you can jump onto your chat and type in your feedback, type in your questions. And what's our next session on?
So our next one is going to be on transfer pricing for a manufacturer, distributor, and we will take up a case study for a software service provider.
Okay.
So we will now we have discussed so far. We've talked about what is transfer pricing policy. We have discussed policy formulation agreements. We've discussed the methods also. So we thought that now let's just dive into some case studies for how we apply all these principles in the context of a trader, manufacturer, and a service provider. So it's going to be a practical session.
Now, a lot of our viewers are young lawyers or practicing lawyers and tax consultants. So in case they want to apply for any career opportunities with you, you can let us know the details so that we can post it to them so that they can reach out to you. And guys, in case you want to learn more about corporate tax or transfer pricing, international tax, you can check out Lawsico's course on corporate tax. But separately, now Ashutosh also is a guest faculty there, takes some sessions, and we will be including this PPT and the videos inside the course as well. However, at the same time, if you want to directly apply to him for like an internship or a job opportunity, I'm asking him if he can share his email ID.
Yeah, so we have the email ID also on the slide. And once you can anyways access my contact details from the web. You can mail your CVs to info@Amicus Services. So the HR team will pick up the CV, and we will, if you are somebody who's interested in international tax and transfer pricing, certainly we will reach out to you. And it's very heartening.
info@amicusservices.in. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, please continue. You were saying something.
Yeah, so I have mentioned this earlier as well, that we are the only law firm where where transfer pricing is a core area of our practice. Normally, transfer pricing is undertaken more by chartered accountants and valuation experts, but interestingly, we have a team full of lawyers, and we are doing transfer pricing policy formulation, documentation, and litigation end to end. And we'll be very happy to add to this a team of lawyers if we have some interested candidates. Well, yes, there is one prerequisite for any tax lawyer, which is that you should be comfortable with the financial statements and balance sheet. You at least need to be able to understand the accounts. So if you've had commerce in 11th, 12th, or even if you had science and you're comfortable with numbers, then tax law is something that you can make a career in, and there is no stopping. You should not have a fear of numbers or a fear of Excel file. I can only say this much, that the judges sitting in the High Court are also lawyers, and they are deciding the most complex questions, be it transfer pricing, GST, or anything. So you should come forward. It's a very interesting area, and learn the principles, and then certainly sky's the limit in this area. All right, Abhyuday.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Again, a pleasure to speak in this webinar. And we will be back again with the next session, next week, Friday at 2 p.m.
Awesome. Next week, meaning after this one. So after about 10 days.
Yes, absolutely.
Got it. Excellent. Thank you so much. And in case anybody is interested in inquiring further, or you want to hop onto the existing batch which is running in the transfer pricing course, you can reach out to me. I've given my number 9717301797. It's there on chat for everyone. And thank you everybody for participating so patiently. And we really enjoy bringing valuable webinars and knowledge to you. So keep participating. Cheers. And thank you, Ashutosh. Thanks everybody.
Okay.
Yeah. Bye. I'm going to close the meeting.